A gunman walked into the carrying a box he claimed was flowers. The old security guard at the door stepped in front of him and said, "Box is heavy for flowers." Frank Delgado had held the door at Riverside Memorial Hospital for 2 years before anyone thought to ask what he'd held before that. The badge on his chest read security, but nobody bothered to read it twice. To them, he was just the quiet older man at the entrance. Gray at the temples, always early, always polite. He said good morning to the nurses. He held the door for families carrying newborns out into the daylight. He never raised his voice. What none of them knew was that 30 years ago, Frank Delgado had been a force reconnaissance Marine, one of the few trained to slip behind enemy lines, gather intelligence no one else could get, and disappear before anyone knew he'd been there. 3 combat deployments, a silver star he never mentioned, a file with more classification stamps than most people would believe existed. Now he was 58 years old, working the night shift in Columbus, Ohio, for $15 an hour, because after his wife passed, the quiet halls of a hospital felt more bearable than an empty house. Dr. Ashley Kern was 29, brilliant, and 3 years out of her emergency medicine residency at Ohio State. She'd graduated near the top of her class, and she carried that fact everywhere she went, like a badge sewn into her white coat. She didn't think much of Frank. To her, he was furniture. A man in a polyester uniform who checked visitor badges and told people where the bathroom was. When patients got rowdy, she expected him to handle it and disappear. If you enjoy stories of courage, justice, and redemption, subscribe to our channel. Then drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you. When he was slow to laugh at her jokes, she assumed he simply didn't understand them. "Frank, can you please keep the waiting room quiet? I'm trying to think," she snapped one Tuesday night, breezing past him without waiting for a response. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the way he always did, calm, unbothered, as if her tone rolled off him like rain off a poncho. The other nurses saw it. Denise, a 20-year veteran, once pulled Ashley aside. "You know he's a veteran, right? Marine," Ashley had shrugged. "Everybody's uncle was in the military. Denise doesn't make him special." She had no idea how wrong she was. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late October when everything changed. Riverside Memorial's emergency room was doing what it always did on a Thursday night: controlled chaos. A car accident victim in Bay 3. A little boy with a broken arm crying in the waiting room. And in Bay 6, behind a thin curtain, a 22-year-old named Marcus Ruiz lay under police guard, his leg wrapped in gauze from a gunshot wound. Marcus wasn't just a gunshot victim. He was the only living witness who could put Damon Castellano, a man the Franklin County DA's office had been chasing for 3 years, inside a warehouse where 2 federal informants had been executed. Marcus was scheduled to testify in 11 days. The 2 uniformed officers stationed outside his room were there because the DA's office wasn't taking chances, except somebody already had. At 9:52 p.m., a man in dark coveralls and a delivery cap walked through the ambulance bay doors carrying what looked like a floral arrangement box. He moved with the loose, unhurried gait of someone who didn't want to be noticed. And for a moment, it worked. Frank noticed anyway. It wasn't any one thing. It was everything at once. The way the man's eyes swept the room in a straight horizontal line instead of wandering like a normal visitor's would. The way his weight stayed forward on the balls of his feet. The way his right hand never fully left the box, fingers curled just slightly wrong for someone carrying flowers. Frank had seen that walk before, in Fallujah, in Kandahar. It was the walk of a man who had trained to kill and was 3 seconds from doing it. "Sir, I need you to stop right there," Frank said, stepping into the man's path, his voice even and low. The man didn't stop walking. "Just a delivery, old-timer." "Box is heavy for flowers," Frank said, "and flowers don't have a trigger guard." The man's face changed. In one fluid motion, the box hit the floor and a compact submachine gun swung up from beneath it. Someone screamed. Patients dropped to the tile. Dr. Ashley Kern froze mid-stride, a chart falling from her hands, her whole body locking up in a way her medical training had never prepared her for. Frank moved first. He closed the 3 feet of distance before the gunman's finger found the trigger, driving his forearm into the weapon and forcing the barrel toward the ceiling as the first burst tore into the drop tile above them. Plaster rained down. Frank's other hand found the man's wrist, twisted hard, and in one motion that looked less like a struggle and more like a mechanism clicking into place, the weapon clattered to the floor, and the gunman went down with it, Frank's knee already pinning his shoulder to the tile. It had taken 4 seconds. "Everybody down and stay down!" Frank barked, and for the first time, his voice filled the entire room, sharp and commanding, nothing like the soft, "Yes, ma'am," tone anyone had ever heard from him. The gunman wasn't done. A second man, the real shooter, the one who'd been waiting by the vending machines pretending to check his phone, pulled a pistol and fired twice toward Bay 6, where Marcus Ruiz lay exposed behind a curtain that wouldn't stop a spitball, let alone a bullet. One of the rounds caught Marcus in the shoulder. The responding officer returned fire, catching the second gunman in the leg and dropping him against the vending machine. But the room was already screaming, already bleeding, already a battlefield nobody in that had ever trained for, except Frank had. "Denise, hard lockdown on Bay 6, now!" he shouted, sliding across the floor to Marcus's side while the first attacker lay zip-tied, Frank's own belt improvised into restraints, beside an overturned gurney. "Everybody not treating a patient, get behind that nurse's station and stay low!" Ashley stood frozen by the med cart, staring at blood pooling under Marcus's shoulder, her mind blank in a way 3 years of residency had never touched. She had seen gunshot wounds before. She had never seen one arrive with someone actively trying to finish the job. "Doctor!" Frank's voice cut through her paralysis like a blade. "I need pressure on this wound. Now. You're the only one close enough." Something in his tone. Not pleading, not panicked, just absolute command, moved her body before her brain caught up. She dropped to her knees beside him. Subclavians intact, entries high and lateral. "We're lucky," Frank said, already packing gauze into the wound with hands that didn't shake. "I need you to hold pressure right here while I check his airway." "How do you?" Ashley started. "Talk later. Pressure now." She pressed down. Frank checked Marcus's breathing, tilted his head, cleared his airway with 2 fingers in a motion so practiced it looked like muscle memory older than Ashley herself. Across the room, a man in his 60s, silver-haired, standing near the reception desk where he'd been waiting on a knee x-ray, had gone very still. His name was Colonel Raymond Whitfield, USS. Marine Corps, retired, and 31 years ago he had commanded a reconnaissance element in the First Gulf War. He was watching Frank's hands move over the wound, watching the way he called out vitals, the cadence, the terminology. But it was what happened next that confirmed it. As the second officer moved past Frank to secure the disarmed gunman, Frank looked up at him for half a second and gave a short, precise nod, chin down, eyes locked, one economical motion. It wasn't a civilian gesture. It was muscle memory from 100 handoffs in 100 rooms just like this one, except with worse lighting and higher stakes. Whitfield straightened up like he'd been struck. He crossed the room in 6 strides, ignoring the chaos, and stood over Frank as he worked. "Recon," Whitfield said quietly. "Not a question." Frank didn't look up. "Not anymore. Just security, sir. Force recon doesn't retire. Marine. It just goes quiet." Whitfield's voice cracked slightly. "I know that hand signal. I trained men to give that hand signal. Only reason you'd still have it wired into your spine after 30 years is if you were one of mine. Or one of ours." For the first time that night, Frank hesitated. 92nd Recon Company. Second deployment, Anbar Province. Whitfield's jaw tightened. "Delgado! Frank Delgado!" He said the name like he was pulling it out of a locked drawer in his memory. You're the one who pulled Torres and Whitman out of that compound in Ramadi. Nobody thought you'd get out with all three of you breathing. 2 of us walked out, Frank said quietly, still working. I've had 18 years to live with the one who didn't. Ashley, still pressing gauze into Marcus's shoulder, looked up between the 2 men, her mind trying and failing to reconcile the quiet security guard she'd dismissed 100 times with whatever this was. Paramedics arrived within minutes, and the became a machine again. This time working correctly. Marcus was stabilized and rushed into surgery. The wounded gunman was cuffed to his hospital bed under a fresh detail of 4 officers instead of 2. The first attacker sat zip-tied against the wall, glaring at nothing, waiting for a jail cell that would hold him for a long time. Detective Karen Osei arrived 20 minutes later to find a scene that made no sense on paper. 2 armed professionals neutralized, 1 witness alive against long odds, and a security guard credited by 3 separate witnesses with disarming an active shooter in under 5 seconds. "Walk me through it," she said to Frank, notebook out. "Not much to walk through," Frank said. "Saw a threat. Handled it." 60-year-old security guard handles an M5 in the hands of a trained shooter, Osei said, unconvinced. "You want to try that again?" It was Whitfield who answered for him, stepping forward with the quiet authority of a man used to being listened to. "Detective, this man is Master Sergeant Frank Delgado, United States Marine Corps, retired, Force Reconnaissance. 2 bronze stars. A silver star he never picked up in person because he was already back in country for his next deployment. I served with men who trained under him. What you're calling luck, I'd call the most economical use of close-quarters combat I've seen outside a live fire exercise." The had gone quiet enough to hear the vitals monitors beeping in Bay 6. Ashley stood a few feet away, blood still drying on her gloves, staring at Frank like she was seeing him. Actually seeing him. For the first time in the 2 years she'd worked beside him. "You've been holding doors for me for 2 years, she said quietly, almost to herself. Frank finally looked tired, the adrenaline draining out of him all at once the way it always had, even decades ago. "Wasn't hiding anything, Doctor. Just wasn't advertising it. Man doesn't need a resume to hold a door open." The story didn't stay quiet for long. By morning, a local news van was parked outside Riverside Memorial, and by that evening, the footage from a bystander's phone. Frank driving the barrel toward the ceiling, the 4-second takedown, had been viewed 2 million times under the headline, "Hospital Security Guard Turns Out to be Marine Special Ops Legend." Frank hated every second of the attention. He turned down 3 interview requests and let Whitfield handle the 4th, insisting the story belonged to Marcus Ruiz and the officers who'd taken a bullet doing their jobs, not to him. But Detective Osei wasn't finished. A shooting like this didn't happen by accident, and a case like Castellano's didn't run on luck. Not for the day's office, and not for the men trying to kill their way out of a conviction. Somebody had handed Castellano's people the exact room number, the exact shift change, the exact gap in the security detail. That wasn't street knowledge. That was inside knowledge. It took her department's IT unit 3 days digging through hospital access logs to find it, and when they did, the room went as quiet as it had the night Whitfield named Frank's rank out loud. At 9:31 p.m., 21 minutes before the first gunman walked through the ambulance bay, someone had used an internal hospital terminal to pull Marcus Ruiz's room assignment, his shift rotation, and the names and schedules of his security detail. The badge scan that unlocked that terminal belonged to a nurse credentialed for exactly that kind of access. A nurse who'd worked the floor for 6 years. A nurse everyone trusted enough to never look twice at what she was doing at a computer after hours. Denise. Osei brought Frank in for the follow-up interview, not because he was a suspect, but because he was the only person on shift that night who'd worked beside Denise long enough to notice if something had changed. And when Osei laid the timestamp in front of him, Frank sat with it a long moment, the way a man sits with a wound he didn't see coming. She's got a kid in community college and a brother who owes money to people who don't send polite reminders, Frank said quietly. I always figured whatever she was carrying, she'd find her way through it clean. She didn't, Osei said. Her brother owed almost $40,000 to a collector with ties to Castellano's organization. 3 weeks ago, somebody made her an offer. Information for a debt forgiven. She told herself it was just a room number. She didn't know what they'd do with it until it was already happening in front of her. When they brought Denise in, she didn't run and she didn't lie. She sat across from Osei with her hands folded on the table and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the wall, and she said the only thing she had left to say. I didn't think anyone would get shot. I told myself it was just information. I told myself that for 3 weeks, right up until I heard the first burst of gunfire and realized what I'd actually done. It was Frank who asked to see her, alone, before they moved her downtown. The detectives let him, mostly because nobody in that building was in a position to tell Frank Delgado no anymore. He didn't raise his voice. He never had. I've buried men who made worse mistakes for better reasons, he told her. And I've buried men who made no mistakes at all and paid for it anyway. What you did put a 22-year-old kid in a hospital bed with a bullet in his shoulder. You're going to have to live with that a long time, same as I've lived with things I did or didn't do. The only thing I can tell you that might help is this. The debt you were trying to pay off doesn't go away because you're sitting in a cell. But the truth does start to mean something again, the day you stop running from it. Denise didn't answer. She just nodded, once, and let them lead her out. Marcus survived surgery. 11 days later, from a hospital bed instead of a courtroom via video testimony, he identified Damon Castellano as the man who ordered the executions in that warehouse. Castellano was convicted 14 months later, in large part because the witness meant to silence him never stopped breathing, and in part because the DA's office, alerted by Osei's discovery, was able to trace the leak all the way back to Castellano's network and add witness tampering and conspiracy to the charges that buried him for good. Denise pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for her cooperation. Her brother's debt, it turned out, no longer mattered to anyone once the men holding it were indicted alongside Castellano. She would serve time. She would also, eventually, have the chance to explain herself to her son. Something Frank made sure the court knew she'd asked for, even if he never told anyone why he'd bothered to ask on her behalf. The hospital board offered Frank a promotion to director of security, a salary that would have let him retire comfortably within a few years. He turned it down and asked, instead, to keep his post at the doors. That's where I'm needed, he told the board. Not behind a desk. Ashley found him there 2 weeks later, back in his usual spot by the entrance, holding the door for a family wheeling out a newborn in a car seat, saying good morning, like nothing in the world had changed. She stopped in front of him, hands in her coat pockets. I owe you an apology, a long one. You don't owe me anything, Doctor. You held pressure on a wound when it mattered. That's the only thing I needed from you that night. I treated you like you were invisible for 2 years. Frank considered that for a moment, then allowed himself something close to a smile. Most people do, with men like me. That's kind of the point of the training. You get good at not being seen, and eventually it becomes who you are, not just what you do. He glanced toward Bay 6, empty now, freshly cleaned. Doesn't mean we're not standing right next to you when it counts. Ashley nodded slowly, something in her expression rearranged for good. I won't forget that again. Nobody ever does, Frank said. Not after the first time they need somebody like me and find out I was there the whole time. He held the door open for the next family walking through, and the next, and the one after that. The same as he had for 2 years, the same as he would tomorrow, and the day after, standing quietly at the threshold between the ordinary world and whatever walked through that door next. Not because anyone asked him to, because that had always been the job, long before anyone knew his name.